Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Wood, and today we're going to focus on self-awareness. Self-awareness. To see oneself clearly. Why would we want to do that? Surely we would want to have a falsely positive view of ourselves. And I'll tell you what, a lot of us do. But actually, there is a strong business case for having a clearer sense of ourselves. Not only does it enable us to manage our weaknesses, it enables us to more effectively play to our strengths. We also know from the research that people who have higher levels of self-awareness are more likely to have better relationships, better careers, be better communicators, be happier with their lives, feel more confident. There's all sorts of great stuff that comes from self-awareness. And it's not modern knowledge. This isn't a modern idea. We can look back to Socrates, right, about 2,500 years ago. The unexamined life is not worth living. He wasn't talking about looking under rocks and that. He was talking about looking within, looking to really discover more about ourselves, about who we are. And then we can step forward to some of the fantastic insights of our time that come from Shakespeare, right? This above all, to thine own self be true, and it will follow as the day the night, thou canst then be false to any man. You know, the more we know ourselves, the more effectively we can navigate the world. We can operate within the world. But as mentioned, self-awareness is not a given, right? There's been some really interesting research in this area, and one example, a group of 1,000 engineers was asked to self-assess on their own performance. 33% of them rated themselves in the top 5% of performers. Out of 1,000 engineers, only one poor, lonely individual rated themselves as below average. Oh, the courage and ownership there, right? But it's not just engineers. I know some of you are making stereotypes about engineers. Look, they looked at 13,000 professionals in another piece of research. And these were professionals that spanned industries as broad as technology, nursing, and finance. And what they found is that there was no correlation, no relationship between people's self-assessment of their performance and objective performance criteria. Those things didn't have any relationship. Isn't that astounding? And then we look to a group close to my heart as someone who has a PhD. You know, I feel a real affinity with those who teach in universities. I've done guest lecturing myself. 94% of university lecturers rate themselves as above average. 94%. So again, you know, it's not a given that we have this clear view of ourselves. So there's been some really interesting research done in this area to go, what are some of the characteristics of hallmarks of people who do have a clearer sense of self, higher self-awareness, and how can we all cultivate a bit more of this? If you're interested in a deeper dive in this area, Tasha Urich is a great person to look up. She's got a TED Talk on this. She's got a book around it, fantastic resource for you. But some of the things she has found in terms of the people who just really have very high levels of self-awareness, one of the things she's found is that these are people who have a clear sense of what their values are, a clear sense of their values. They also have a clear sense of their passions. What are the things that really engage them, that they really get enjoyment from, that they're drawn to? They're also really clear on what their aspirations are. Who do they want to be? What's the kind of life that they want to have? Who do they want to grow into? Here's a really interesting characteristic about them too that she's found, and that is that they just have a more accurate view of how well they suit the environment they're in, how well they fit the requirements of that environment. I find this particularly interesting because my area of psychology, my background's in an area called differential psychology, otherwise known as individual differences. And that looks at how people differ in terms of personality, values, motives, aspirations, intelligence, things like that. And one of the really interesting models that looks at the difference between wisdom and intelligence is one proposed by Robert Sternberg. And he talks about a crucial hallmark of wisdom being the ability to recognize the environments one's better suited to. What are the environments that enable you to really play to your strengths, build your talents, that sort of stuff. But also recognizing when the environment we're in isn't a great fit and trying to adapt the environment to better suit us and having the wisdom to know when you need to actually just go somewhere else to find somewhere you're better suited to. So one of those hallmarks, one of the pillars as they're referred to, is recognizing what environments you're suited to and being able to orientate towards those, find those. Some of the other things that are associated with really high levels of self-awareness are an understanding of the patterns in your thinking, in your feelings, and in your behavior. What are some of the things that I notice about myself? What are some of the reoccurring ways I have of explaining things, of seeing things, of viewing things? What are the things that tend to prompt me to feel pleasant or unpleasant emotions? What are the ways I tend to respond and to react in different situations? And interestingly enough, those reactions and what they tell us about our capabilities and about our gaps, our areas for development, are another important area of self-awareness. And the final one is awareness of our impact on other people. And this is interesting actually, because when we look at self-awareness, there's two types. There's internal self-awareness, and this is me going, am I aware of what my preferences are, what my values are, my purposes, my passions, all that sort of stuff. That's internal stuff. But then there's self-awareness in respect of other people. That's external self-awareness. Am I aware of other people's perceptions of me? How other people tend to find me, how they would describe me, what my reputation might be. Interestingly enough, in leadership psychology, what we often look at is how we can close the gap between identity and reputation. That's how you achieve real authenticity, is closing that gap between identity and reputation. But that requires us to have some insight into both of those areas, the internal self-awareness, but also that external self-awareness. The interesting thing there, though, is that what the research suggests is that there's no correlation between those two. In other words, how self-aware you are of what's going on in here, what's important to you, it doesn't have any actual corresponding relationship between how aware you are of other people's perceptions of you and opinions of you. And I definitely relate to this myself. I consider myself quite internally self-aware. I have a good idea of who I want to be, what my fallibilities are, the challenges, all these sorts of things. But I'll tell you what, I've had the mirror held up to me a number of times in a way that I've found quite surprising in terms of other people's perceptions of me. And this actually gives us a clue as well in terms of how we can all become more self-aware and have a clearer sense of ourselves. And one of the key things there is actually being more accepting of other people's perceptions. Now, I have spent a lot of time in my career giving people feedback on how they're perceived by others. And what I always tell people is that people's perceptions don't always capture what your intentions are or how you might want to have been seen in that set of circumstances, or even necessarily what actually happened. But people's perceptions are their reality. So being able to accept that people will have perceptions which reflect their reality, which may not marry up with your own, is a crucial component in terms of increasing your self-awareness. Because if you have the idea that people must see things in the way you see things and are not entitled to their own perceptions of your behavior, then what you will tend to do is to litigate against those, to deny them, to dismiss them, to argue against them. Whereas actually, if you accept that people are entitled to their perceptions and that they can be different than your own, then you can get better at finding out what those perceptions are and modifying your behavior in order to influence those perceptions, to have you seen in the way that you desire, if you have the motivation for that. But you have to accept people's perceptions. You also have to accept reality. All of us are human, and that means none of us are going to be perfect. None of us are going to be strong across every area. All of us are going to fail to be who we want to be on a regular occurrence. We're going to fail to, perform as we'd like. That's human. Acceptance of reality is crucial, and that requires us to be self-accepting too. Tell you what, the biggest journey for a lot of us is self-acceptance. It is one of the most meaningful things that we can pursue as people, and that is to recognize, again, that we're not always going to be who we want to be, and that's okay. Now, I don't want you to mistake what I'm saying there to be an abdication of responsibility to get better. Wanting to get better as a person is crucial. It's one of the fundamental things that drives us, that puts fuel in the tank. But it has to come from a place of self-acceptance around the parameters and limitations of us as members of these species. Another thing which is really important in terms of creating greater self-awareness is cultivating humility. Cultivating humility. Now, this is an interesting thing to talk about in a New Zealand cultural context, because there is no shortage of humility and humbleness within New Zealand. We're a very humble culture. There's an expression in Māoridom which translates into the kumara does not talk about its own sweetness, that really captures what a humble sort of society we are. In fact, I really didn't get just how humble we are until I heard Phil Kogan speak on a podcast recently. Now, Phil Kogan is the most successful New Zealand TV presenter ever, by a long shot. No one comes close. He is the host of The Amazing Race, which is the longest running and most watched reality TV show in the world. And it's a Kiwi, it's a New Zealander who hosts that. We don't have anyone else who's achieved that level of success in TV presenting. Nothing close to it. And he was talking about the cultural difference between operating in the US environment versus New Zealand in terms of that humility that we have as a nation. And he was using the example of a TV show that he used to host in New Zealand in the 80s. I used to watch it when I was a kid. And it was the New Zealand version of a US show. And the US show was called That's Incredible! And on it, you had people who'd done really cool stuff, you know, innovators, inventors, stunts people just doing really incredible stuff. They brought that show to New Zealand and Phil Kogan hosted it. But when they brought it to New Zealand, they went, well, we can't call it that here. So they Kiwiized the title. I'm just going to give you a second. Let's see if any of you can guess. What do you think would be a sufficiently humble New Zealand version of That's Incredible? I'll tell you this right now. Don't believe me. You Google this later. The New Zealand version was called That's Fairly Interesting. That tells you everything you need to know about the New Zealand culture of humility there. So for a lot of us, this isn't a big one. But that humility and cultivating that humility, it's not about feeling that you're not good enough or that you don't need to self-promote or any of those things. It's just about recognizing that you may not be correct. You may not be accurate in your perceptions and views. And cultivating that humility is crucial in terms of enhancing our self-awareness. But another thing that we need to do, as well as being open to that idea that we may not have all the answers, we may not know everything, that there might be other perceptions, is we need to be curious about what those other perceptions and ways of seeing things and ways of seeing us might be. So cultivating curiosity is another crucial component of how we become more self-aware. But arguably the most important is getting in the habit of asking what, not why, when it comes to our experiences of the world. What we often do is when things don't go according to plan, we go, well, why did that happen? You know, why did this happen to me? We get into this big why of the world. And when we ask why, we have a tendency to ruminate, to dwell on things, to replay things. Why did that happen? Why didn't that go as I'd like? Oh, why me? Why this? Whereas if we can shift that to what, so what can I learn from this? What happened there? What could I do differently in future? We move from rumination to introspection, to reflection in a way that empowers us and is useful to us in terms of our ability to go forward more effectively in the world with a clearer view of ourselves. So team, ask what, not why.